hold and it won't let go of us now.
Something here is calling us forward, upward motion. We're drops in one ocean, roll on.
Will you rise up with me today? Lift up your voice
and boldly say,
we are the ones we've been waiting for. Live the dream of your highest calling. Be the hope of a new day dawning. We're the ones who can make a difference. Let's stand together, sharing gifts for the world that's waiting for a change that we're all creating. It's the
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to the fourth session of New Thought on the News that is produced by the Association for Global New Thought. We have Reverend Kevin Ross along with Jim Kenny as our guest this evening, and we're going to get right to it. As many of you who have attended the series before know, we always say that New Thought on the News is produced by the Association for Global New Thought because our mission is one of spiritually guided social activism. And this idea of New Thought on the News, it came about because we knew that in our times, we need this fresh, more conscious approach to the news that we hear in the headlines every day, which can be daunting and scary and very challenging. So this is a chance in this series for us to have a real dialogue on how topics in the news can be seen through the eyes of New Thought spiritual principles, cultural sea change, and a more evolutionary lens. So we're going to get started right away. I'm going to ask my co-host Stephen Pope to introduce Reverend Kevin Ross.
Our main facilitator tonight is the AGNT leader, Reverend Kevin Ross. Insiders just call him Rev Kev. He's the senior minister at the Unity Church of Sacramento, California, and also senior fellow of the Mountain Valley Chamber of the American Leadership Forum, a member also of the Sacramento Area Congregations Together, SACT, nice acronym, and he's respected for his role as a social justice activist, which is what brings him here tonight. Reverend Kevin is a 3-time delegate to the Parliament of the World's Religions, and he's also served as a guest chaplain for the California State Senate, and has been called on numerous occasions to conduct cultural competency trainings for the California Department of Social Services. All of these important. He's also a popular interview guest for numerous magazines, newspapers, blogs, radio, and national television shows. We should all add webcasts to that, including the Oprah Winfrey Show. He has shared the stage with luminaries ranging from His Holiness the Dalai Lama to President Nelson Mandela and Ila Gandhi, U.S. Congressman Ami Bera, and Dr. Miriam Wright Edelman of the Children's Defense Fund. He's a graduate of Morehouse College, 2-time Humanitarian Award recipient, an inductee into the Martin Luther King Jr. International Clergy Hall of Honor, and travels internationally, participating in dialogues and bridge-building activities that bring leaders from diverse backgrounds across faith lines to build the beloved community.
Thank you, Stephen. Rev Kev, I'm going to ask you now if you would begin the webinar today by giving us an opening blessing.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that introduction. Thank you, everyone. If you would just take a moment wherever you are to turn within and just recognize that right where you are, something wonderful is happening, that you're able to use this technology to be a force for good in the world. It means that you are part of the evolutionary impulse that is unfolding in the universe for the greater good. And so, loving presence, we give thanks for this unique forum that allows us to adjust our seeing so that we can see rightly a future worth living for. We call forth inspiration and guidance and insight at the deepest parts of us so that as we listen and as we participate and as we are engaged, we are engaging and initiating something new, something wonderful, something yet to be seen that will bring forth the highest good and greatest joy for all of humanity. We give thanks for this divine idea called the Association for Global New Thought, all of those who are part of it, and what good will emerge because we're here. For this and so much more, we say, and so it is. Amen.
Thank you so much, Kevin. For those who have not been on the broadcast before, I'd like to introduce Jim Kenny. He is a very good friend of mine, first and foremost. He is co-founder and executive director of Common Ground, which is an adult educational organization and study center headquartered in Chicago. He is author of Thriving in the Crosscurrent, Clarity and Hope in a Time of Cultural Sea Change. And as many of you know, this entire series is based on the concepts in that book because Jim is able to contextualize cultural sea change in a very precise and enlightening manner. He is a founding trustee of the International Committee for the Peace Council and its project coordinator, which brings together influential religious and spiritual leaders to serve world peace. Not a bad mission. He is co-editor of the Interreligious Insight Journal and former founding trustee and global director of a Council for the Parliament of the World's Religions. So welcome again, Jim.
Thank you. Glad to be here again.
Okay, so the foundations for this salon is a 4-part tutorial based on Jim's book and model of cultural sea change. And if you haven't already checked that out, you should go to agnt.today/recordings, and you'll be able to take at your own pace that 4-part tutorial. It's very enlightening. You'll also find some valuable handouts that'll guide you through our conversations. So I think we should get right into the topic this evening, which I have sort of tentatively called Racism and Radical Renewal. So I'm going to ask Reverend Kevin if he would begin by making some overview remarks to get us into the conversation.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you everyone for joining and watching and listening and being a part of this. I think, first of all, it's wonderful that this forum exists that will allow us to not receive our opinions about life from media that does not align with our core values. And so what's important about this New Thought on the News Salon series that the Association for Global New Thought is providing for us is an opportunity to perhaps look at the various events that we're all affected by on a daily basis and have some reinterpretation of it and representation of it, and perhaps even some throw out another lens for looking at it from the concept of a new thought. And when we're many people, as Carlton Pearson likes to say, there's a lot of us who've been in new thought, claim to be a new thought, but haven't had a new thought in the last 30, 40 years. So we hope that tonight you will open yourself to a new idea about how it is. And so to offer just a possible lens that we can be looking through as it relates to new thought, the idea that there is a conspiracy of good unfolding on behalf of the universe and all who inhabit it, versus there is a conspiracy against us. There's an idea, a new thought would be that something is unfolding that is for us, and things that are happening are not happening to us, they're happening for our highest good and greatest joy. And so I'd like to just offer that as a framework in which to look, to listen, to consider some of the ideas that are offered here today. Another thing about New Thought to consider in this conversation, particularly around racism and renewal, is New Thought tends to look at things not from the perspective of its polar opposites, being polarized, but we're looking to see what is the unifying thread that courses through all of life and all of existence, to see the things that we would not see if we are only looking at life through this lens of polarization, us versus them, red, black, win, lose. New Thought would say that there is a win-win-win possibility at all times if we have the eyes to see it. And so tonight the invitation is particularly around this idea of race and renewal. I invite us to have eyes that can see and ears that can hear things afresh and anew, and perhaps you have something open up in you that will bring forth a what I like to call a tough-minded optimism for these times. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, that's a wonderful phrase, tough-minded optimism for these times, because we can't really be Pollyanna looking through rose-colored glasses anymore. We have to do our homework, and the New Thought movement is well poised to form communities that are activist from a spiritually mature point of view, but definitely not to sequester themselves and hide from the conditions of our day. But that takes discipline, and it takes homework, and it takes reading, and it takes information gathering. And I really like that phrase you just used. So let's now turn to Jim Kenny and ask Jim for some opening remarks about the sea change concept and how it creates a framework for this conversation this evening.
Hi, and Kevin, I thought that was terrific. I like that, and I love tough-minded optimism. That's very cool. I like that. Now, in each of our preceding sessions, I've taken about 3 minutes to sort of summarize what we're talking about when we talk about cultural evolutionary sea change. That's my term, and sea change refers to this. I'm a very strong believer that cultural evolution is real. By cultural evolution, I simply mean the slow but inexorable movement of our core civilizational and cultural values. And we can talk about one culture, like American culture or European, but my view is that this is happening all over the world at different rates. People always ask that. Sorry about that. But that cultural evolution is the slow but inexorable movement. I'm trying to make it be quiet. Of our core values toward a closer fit with reality. So let me give you a quick example of that, which is that, for example, 100 years ago, slavery, and throughout most of human history, slavery made very good sense. It made good sense to the world's religions. Every single one of the world's great religious traditions has numerous passages justifying, commenting on, sometimes modifying, but essentially approving slavery. But at a point not too far distant in our past, we began to realize that slavery is always and everywhere wrong. That's a wonderful example of cultural evolution, of our core values catching up with reality. The idea, of course, is that as far as reality is concerned, whatever that means, and if you really want to, we can get into that, but we all know what I'm talking about. Slavery has always been really, really wrong, but it takes us a while to catch up. Women have never been inferior to men, but throughout most of human prehistory and history, that's been the dominant assumption. We're living through a radical period in human history in which our culture and cultures all over the world are realizing that patriarchy is simply wrong, simply false. It's always been assumed by human cultures throughout prehistory and history that the earth was unfragile, that there was nothing we could possibly do to mess it up. You could throw all the junk in the world into the ocean and you wouldn't affect its functioning. Well, very, very recently in our human past, we've begun to realize that that's completely wrong. It's completely false. There's a wonderful example of our core values catching up with reality. But I believe that although cultural evolution happens all the time, slow but inexorable, I should get my hand up where you can see it, slow but inexorable progress, I also believe it's punctuated. And I believe that there are very rare occasional periods in history when all those value changes, which are interpenetrating and interlocking, take us a dramatic leap forward when the cultural evolutionary shift is accelerated. And my argument, you can hear it coming, is that we're living in one of those times right now. Why is it that it doesn't seem like it? Well, that's what we've been talking about. So cultural evolution is real. Cultural evolution is punctuated. And the third point that I've been making is that there is resistance. And I use the term eddies to talk about the resistance, since there is a flow. An eddy is a counter-evolutionary whirlpool, if you will, a backlash, resistance to that flow. I think the dominant eddies in our time are fundamentalism, fascism, oligarchy, by which I mean the control of global wealth by a few, and hegemony, which is just an old Greek term that I use to mean the control of global political power by a few. So we've been talking about that as we go along. I suppose the last thing I should add is that the signs of change are everywhere. So let me begin as we shift to our actual topic, racism, racism, racialism, and radical renewal. Do you know that today in Nashville, Tennessee, a museum of peace and justice opened that has the most extraordinary and the first ever in the United States exhibit and monument memorial dedicated to lynching. I really want you all to look it up. It's Nashville Memorial to Lynching that opened up today, even as we speak. It's opening up today, and it is apparently mind-blowing. I've been looking at pictures, and Kevin is nodding. You know about it, and it is absolutely stunning, and it's in Nashville. So, am I right about Nashville, or I think it might. Anyway, it's in the Deep South. So, what I want to say is this, that we all know that racism, or we would like to believe that racism of the sort that characterized the Civil War period has been steadily declining as we move from the Civil War down to our own time. But we look around and it seems to us that racism is absolutely in bloom. It's fresh, it's new, it's revitalized, and we see it in police and people being arrested at Starbucks and thrown off golf courses. These are just stories in the news for the last couple of days. So what's going on? What I want to argue is that cultural evolution has indeed begun to deal with what I like to call archaic tribalist racism. And that was the racialism and the racism of the Civil War. It was, and long before, throughout, again, as I will keep saying, throughout human prehistory and history. That racism was always based on fear of the stranger. And when you think about it, fear of the stranger makes a bit of sense. That stranger coming up over the hill, I don't know who he is. I don't quite recognize his or her looks. And that means it could be a threat that's moving in my direction. Well, gradually, as we learn more about each other, that whole idea that the stranger is a threat is going to be harder and harder to maintain, because sooner or later, strangers become neighbors and neighbors become friends. So that whole idea of tribalist, archaic racism is inevitably going to decline if human culture does in fact evolve, and I think it does. But so what are we seeing in our own day, and what have we been seeing, especially since the end of the Vietnam War? The white supremacist movement in the United States has congealed, has come together, bringing together very disparate groups, the Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazis, who after World War II were bitterly opposed to each other because the Klan, they saw themselves as patriots, and the neo-Nazis were the enemy. But after the Vietnam War, they started to come together. Why? Because new forces were stirring, cultural evolution was presenting new ideas. The notion that to be a success in America, you needed to be white, male, and Christian was suddenly coming under attack. And so white male Christians began to come together, and they were energized by the militarism of the Vietnam War. By the way, I'm talking about a tiny, tiny fraction of veterans from the Vietnam War that were touched by this, but nevertheless, it was the cauldron in which all of this was began to heat up, and so on. And so, white supremacy doesn't grow out of fear of the stranger; it grows out of fear of personal loss. The catalyst for what we're seeing, the new racism, which I call backlash racism, is identity crisis. I'm white, I'm male, I'm Christian. Why doesn't that work anymore? Being white's not enough. I'm supposed to have respect for people of color. Being male is not enough. I'm supposed to have respect. And who knows, I may be reporting to a female boss. How am I supposed to deal with that? And Christian, that's not enough anymore. I have to nod respectfully in the direction of Jews and Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists and Native Americans and God knows what else. And how am I supposed to cope? You're taking my world away from me. And so naturally, I am fair game for someone that comes along and says, let's make America great again. What we're really saying is, let's make America white, male, and Christian again. So there's a big difference between the old style racism that our parents struggled in themselves to overcome, and the new racism today, which is backlash racism, which grows out of identity crisis. I will say this: it's terrifying. It's horrifying, but I believe that backlash racism is less dangerous than the old society pervading racism. This is not the racism of the Civil War, which you'll recall infected both sides. There was almost as much racism in the North as there was in the South. It was just theologized differently. But people in the North were just as racist and just as enthusiastic about moving Black people to Africa or whatever. Even Abraham Lincoln thought that might be the solution. So that's not what we're dealing with today. We're dealing with something that is virulent, it's violent, it's terrifying, but also it is, I want to say, evanescent. Evanescent means in the process of dissolving and disappearing. In order to be, and do you understand that this kind of racism is intimately inter-involved, I have to stop here, but intimately inter-involved with homophobia, because homophobia challenges my identity. It's intimately inter-involved with the defense of patriarchy, because the white male Christian thing really doesn't allow for a woman, for a society in which women are suddenly being heard from, and maybe I'm reporting to one at work. I even believe that it's involved, it feeds into the defense of the abuse of the earth. So I think all of these things are inter-involved, and I think here's the key. They're all insupportable. You have to be, in order to believe that people of other cultures, other races, other religions, other genders are radically inferior to yourself, you have to be heroically, athletically,
ignorant. Now, it can be done, but it's going to be tougher and tougher as the days go on. So I'm not optimistic. I'm hopeful.
Well, as usual, Jim Kinney, in the 3 decades I've known you, the way that you deliver these insights are so powerful and thought-provoking. So I really thank you for that. I'm going to ask now Rev Kev. I saw him taking notes and paying close attention to these comments. So I'm going to ask Kevin to jump right in here and give some impressions of some of the things that you've said that occurred to him as you were speaking.
Thank you for that, Jim. And I want to begin by saying what we're doing right now in reflecting on race and reflecting on it from a evolutionary perspective is very luxurious. It's a very ivory tower sort of way, and I'm glad that there's this ability to think at this level, because we do need this level of thought around it. I want to, for the sake of those who would be listening to this, who fall within the many groups that have been at the affect of any form of racism or systemic racism, speak to just for a moment what I would say is not Jim's attempt to state that one was better than the other. Because from the perspective of those who have been at the affect of any form of racism, neither feels better. It is a luxury to be able to make that comment from the perspective of and discussion and observation. But for those with lived experience, whether it be lived experience from the transatlantic slave trade, which would be my ancestors, or those who are Native American, who have lived experience, they may hear that comment in a way that would suggest that we're saying one is better than the other. But what I am hearing you say is that there is an evolution in how racism has been perceived, one from this tribalistic approach that seemed to be widespread throughout society and seemingly acceptable, and another perspective around identity. And this piece around identity is one that seems to be one that we're most familiar with in these times, this idea that there is a superior me and an inferior you. And from a New Thought perspective, we find this to be absolutely false. There's only one fundamental idea, and there's only one truth, and that we're all equal. And we were not only that we're not all equal, but we all have equal value and contribution that can be made to society. However, the experience of this, as we all know, is that there are those, and when we're speaking of patriarchy and women and African Americans and slavery and all of it, Jim Crow, all of these different things, the common denominator, as you pointed out, is white males, that hold and that have historically held this idea of superiority. And so from a New Thought perspective and from an evolutionary perspective, I think that evolution has moved slowly on these fronts, not because we aren't ready for it to move, the broader culture is not ready for it to move, but there has been a slow evolution in the thinking of white males in our society around superiority. Women have always known. Somebody said to me, my wife, man says, my wife I wear the pants of my family. because my wife gave me permission to wear the pants of my family. I think women have always understood, Stephen is waving his hand, women have always understood that we each have equal share and equal contribution to the family structure and to societal structure. But as we raise this idea of who's evolving, and from a cultural evolutionary perspective, the culture, since the dominant culture is around this whole idea of superiority and inferiority, is held mainly with patriarchy, white male patriarchy. This evolution among this class of individuals is what more and more I would like to see raised and named. And I'm thankful that you have named it, but continue to raise it and name it, because it is only when this sort of thinking is named, exposed, and offered some solutions. And where I see the solution being is around healing an erroneous idea about oneself and one's group. I think there's some wherever this false narrative came from, there's an opportunity for it to be healed. I'll stop right there because I'm just going on. You want to talk about this a little bit more?
Yeah, this is, I enjoy these discussions the most, and I'm asking Stephen if also and wants to join the conversation at any point, please feel free. But first I'm going to ask Jim to respond to some of what Kevin was saying, because this dialectic is exactly what we're trying to achieve here.
First of all, I'm going to push back a little bit, Kevin, because one of the things that I hear most often and that sort of upsets me the most is the the ivory tower, the ivory tower comment. And I do get that a lot. And ivory tower means you're disconnected from the real world. In splendid isolation, you're cooking up these ideas. But if you were ever to touch the real world, you'd realize you have no idea what you're talking about. Your subsequent remarks, you're muted, but your subsequent remarks made it clear that that's not what you were saying. So I would just say, let's throw out the ivory tower, because that's I don't think it's helpful, and it is profoundly offensive. What I'm trying to say is not that at the front, when you are the victim of racial abuse, it doesn't matter if it's happening to you in a Civil War context or in a 2017, 2018 context. It feels just as bad, it's just as hurtful, it's just as disorienting, it's just as dangerous, it's just as violent as it ever was. I'm talking about social, cultural change. And so I'm saying that we're not facing the kind of society-wide malaise and dysfunction. I do not believe that the whole of American society is racialist or racist. Racialist, I use that term to mean to refer to the people that say, oh, you know how they are. But when racialism leads me to hate, then it's racism. And I do not for a moment believe that our society is as racialist or racist as it was 100 or 200 years ago. I know that's not true. But there is, at a time when we were beginning to think we were post-racist or post-racial, and Bill Clinton suggested that, and Jimmy Carter suggested that, Martin Luther King hoped that we would see that, Jesse Jackson hoped that we would see that, but all of a sudden we see this virulent new and very ugly racism. We see the rebirth of the Klan. We see neo-Nazis. We see the Klan and the neo-Nazis coming together and marching. Now their numbers are tiny, but their force is dramatic, and their symbolism is horrifying. So all I'm saying is that I am saying this is not as societally cancerous as was the Civil War and pre-Civil War racism, but it's terrifying. But I'm also saying this: it is evanescent because there is such a thing as cultural evolution. At the very beginning, Kevin, you said something that is right here in my notes, and had you not mentioned it, I would. The idea that this is not a win-lose kind of situation, ultimately. I usually use the term non-zero. It's a non-zero sum game. A zero-sum game is where there's a clear winner and loser. A non-zero-sum game is like a barn raising, or the village coming together to raise a child, or all of us coming together to fix what ails our community. And I think that's what we're involved in, and that's what New Thought is all about, and that's what's going to help us weather this racialist storm. All I'm saying is not that it's not horrifying, but that in a way that could not have been said during the pre-Civil War and Civil War period, we can see that this is something that must necessarily fade. It makes less and less sense. Let me just read one little quick thing that I wanted to throw in. This is from an article that appeared 1.5 years ago in Scientific American. And the article is called "Race is a Social Construct, Scientists Agree." More than 100 years ago, American sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois was concerned that race was being used as a biological explanation for what he understood to be social and cultural differences between different populations of people. He spoke out against the idea of white and black as discrete groups, claiming that these distinctions ignored the scope of human diversity. Science today would favor Du Bois. Today, the mainstream belief among scientists is that race is a social construct without any biological meaning whatsoever. And yet, you might still open a study on genetics in a major scientific journal and find categories like white and black being used as biological variables. Today, we're beginning to realize that it's culture that distinguishes between people, ethnicity, which includes culture, but not race, not race. Well, you understand what I'm saying. And so to be a racist today means you're disconnected in an even more powerful way than we had imagined. I'm just arguing that that's not a sustainable position, ultimately.
Yes, okay. So I know that Kevin's going to want to make some remarks, and I wanted to say briefly that there are two things that occur to me as I'm listening to both of you speak. One of them is the fact that we all have noticed a quickening or an acceleration, which is exacerbated, if you will, by social media and the mainstream media, and the fact that everybody's in on the game now. And that information is extremely difficult to track or to verify, and that people aren't seeming to care too much about whether the stuff they're putting out there is verifiable or not. And so there's a kind of acceleration point where it's almost impossible to keep up. But to me, in terms of an evolutionary system, that usually is fair warning that the more accelerated and the more dramatic conditions become is kind of evidence in and of itself that something's about to pop. And so we could look at it from that point of view. And secondly, luckily, because of listening to what both of you were saying, luckily we have a kind of a way to quantify what is going on in the society. And it's the fact that we're talking about that very small, what Trump calls his base, that is making so much noise and quickening in this time and having so many platforms at its disposal, that it seems to be much louder than it is. But I'm maintaining, and I think Kevin, when I actually let him talk, what he's going to support is that the response to that of an overwhelming rising up of the common citizenry, of the grassroots, spiritually motivated social activists and others, is in fact, maybe the best news, because the bad stuff has catalyzed all of this. And so here we are with an opportunity for breakthrough. So I'm going to ask you, Kevin, to comment on that.
To comment on this idea, I must comment on a couple things before I comment on that. One, when I look at racism today, I'm looking at it from the perspective of what is now systematically a part of a small minority holding power over those who cannot, from a systematic perspective, free themselves of that control and domination and power. So I'm not necessarily speaking just of people's attitudes, but I'm talking about those having the power to exercise the attitudes that they have. And so that's where I'm seeing, so I can be prejudiced, you can be prejudiced, but someone who's actually functioning from a racist perspective has power to exercise his prejudice. So that's the point I'm making about racism in and of itself. Laws and systems and culture itself, culture dominated by media, etc. Now, when we're talking about sea change, Barbara, as you mentioned, I do see sweeping sea change taking place in this era as it relates to racism because of what I call cell phone activists, individuals who are now exposing more and more through the use of social media, through the use of cell phone and technology, actions that were once hidden from the general public. So we're now able to see things that we have not been able to see before. And there are more and more people entering this space, and similar to what happened in the 60s around the Vietnam War, just in and around that period, when media had been used to expose how awful racism played out with the hosing of the children in the Children's March and sicking of dogs on individuals. It has now exposed something, and those of us of good conscience are finding our voices in this moment. And so this is where I see most of the conscious activism taking place at this particular time. People are now more connected than ever before. That's another sweeping change. The world is more connected than it has ever been before. And so the formations of uncommon bedfellows, individuals who would not have been holding tightly together, can do that all around the world now to press against these social structures. But I do think that, I do maintain that a big part of the pace at which cultural change takes place, particularly in the United States, has to do with more and more awakening those who have the power and the influence to affect culture. If the media organizations, I understand there are 5 major media outlets owned by a small few, a small minority of individuals. If you have the control to shape what images there are in society with media, until we shift the consciousness and the thinking of those who hold power and control over these entities, the pace at which the total society moves is being pressed. Now, I will say, I agree that we are in a place, in a space where there is pushback. I think you called it backlash. I think there is backlash. I think tomorrow we're going to see some backlash as it relates to the arrest of Bill Cosby, and the conviction of Bill Cosby in the news. I think it's going to be an interesting dynamic in the cultural waters that we see. Now, to Barbara's point, I do believe, however, that people like you and me and those that are listening who see beyond the idea that we are separate, that we are polarized, that there is a superior me and an inferior you, when we come together we can help shift the attitudes and the ideas of those that apparently have not held this view. But I believe it takes place in dialogues, some very brave dialogues, moving past the paradigm of being colorblind to color brave, being able to name certain things in certain spaces where I have influence. So that having the conversations with those who are power brokers, I think it's important to lift these issues before them. Not African American Kevin having the conversation with some white male who holds power, which is great, and I do that in my congregation. But it has more effect when someone who shares a common skin tone, if you will, or ideology, if you will. It seems that we have the ability to move the dial with those that we are most alike and connected to. And yet I do know, and I do agree, that race as it is has no scientific or biological, it's not scientifically or biologically true, verifiable. There's nothing different between your DNA and mine except a few atoms, you know. But socially, it is a construct. And I think that you and I and others who hold this attitude of a world that works for all, those of us who are choosing to lean in this moment and have courageous conversations, those of us who have had enough of the tension between each other, are saying enough is enough. And we're helping to create that next wave by pushing up to co-create a world that works for all. But I do think from a boots on the ground perspective, what we're doing right now can appear luxurious. I'm not saying to you that it is, I'm saying it appears. So I just wanted to preface my earlier remarks, so that individuals would know that we're not being insensitive comparing one form to the other from the experiential perspective, but from the theoretical and the practical ideas. I do think more and more of us are waking up, and I think it's long overdue.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. No, that is true. You know, it's there's so many dimensions to the conversation. Also, I see that Stephen has raised his hand, and it looks like he has something to contribute here. The time is going real fast tonight, so let's keep moving along. Stephen?
Thank you. Oh, I'll keep it brief. I just wanted to extend and agree with and riff a little on what both Jim and Kevin have been saying, and remind us historically that prejudice has not primarily been racist. In most of the culture, the fact that we in America had black slaves and that we look at racism as being the primary foundation of prejudice, well, guess what? Trump is now dividing us along winners and losers across racial lines. So he's saying that he's grouping white liberals like me together with black liberals like Kevin as being losers. Historically, if you look at it, in the Bible, it talks about racism, as Kevin talked about. Yeah, well, the Greeks and the Romans had slaves who were also white. If we look at recent history in Africa, there's been terrible issues between people who were all black. It's not, we have to focus on prejudice and treating people as they're different because of whatever social, economic, racial, language, religious, we can always find some difference. And the last thing I want to say is historically, the biggest wars have been internecine. So it's your cousins that you hate the most. People who are 90% the same. There's a great joke about it that I'll spare you about, boy, if I agree on you 90%, but you're a Southern Baptist left-handed, I'm a Southern Baptist right-handed, then I hate you more than somebody who's a Muslim. So if you look throughout history, the most terrible wars, or look in the Middle East now about the wars between Sunni and Shiite Muslims. There are bigger strife going on there than between Muslims and Jews, Muslims and Christians, Muslims and communists. So I almost look like it's terribly insensitive to say the whole debate about racism is overstated. The debate is about prejudice, and racism is just the current American casting of groups that act primarily out of prejudice. And I'd love to hear what Jim and Kevin have to say to that.
Yeah, okay, so thank you for that insight. Hold on, Kevin, it looks like you'd like to say something. I'm going to continue instead of taking questions right now, because as I've said before, this is an inconvenient time for people to tune in live, but we get a lot of hits on the recordings after this, which announcements go out tomorrow. And this is such a good discussion. I want to make sure that all of you get as many remarks in as you can before we close up for tonight. So Kevin, did you want to take the mic next?
Yeah, just really quick. I do agree, Stephen. The Willie Lynch letters, if anybody's familiar with this bit of history, the Willie Lynch letters really punctuates what you were saying in terms of how do we, and for those that are not familiar, Willie Lynch was a slave owner, and he was really a slave trainer, plantation trainer. He would go out and workshop on how to divide the slaves so that even among them, there was this sense of inferiority and superiority and rank and status. So he had it mapped out, and he put it in a book. It's called the Willie Lynch Letters. And so I totally recognize that we learn how to feel better. Even if you're traveling, if you're traveling and you get to be in first class and the person gets to sit in the back, I mean, it's embedded in our society that one should have an advantage over the other, and it's all an erroneous part of the human condition that we need to evolve from. And so I'm hoping that this is what these sweeping changes will bring about, that we be more and more aware and awake. And I do think we're more aware and awake, obviously, than we were in the United States from the perspective of the transatlantic slave trade and what took place here in the United States. But I do think that with more and more voices naming this, and what is a sweeping change, I will tell you this, Jim, what is a sweeping change is that more white males are doing what you're doing more than ever before. I sit on a number of leadership groups and so forth, and there's much discussion about naming it from the perspective of white males who have privilege and are in power. They're naming it, they're calling it out, they are over it. And so you're seeing a growing number take more on in this discussion. And I think that's where we're going to see some of the greatest benefit with this, along with the work that is happening from various organizations, consciousness-raising organizations and civil rights organizations and social justice organizations, and all of us who are being buoyed up for such a time as this.
Jim?
Hi, let me just say that I totally agree with Stephen. I also agree with what Kevin just said. I'm glad that Stephen brought up the whole idea of prejudice. I might not say prejudice. I would probably say something a little stronger, like superiority, which leads to supremacy. And prejudice is sort of the polite manifestation of superiority, and supremacy is the rude and dominant expression of that. But you're right, that's what's been going on. I studied for a time in the Soviet Union, and this was back in the late 60s, 1968. And when Martin Luther King died, I was in what was then Leningrad. And boy, did I take heat from my supercilious, superior Soviet friends who were very anxious to tell me that they had no racism. Well, they had no people of color. But you wouldn't want to be a Tajik or an Uzbek in Moscow or Leningrad. And you know what's interesting? You know what they called those people? Blacks. Their skin wasn't dark, but they called them blacks. Isn't that interesting? But they insisted, we don't have racism, you invented that. But they did have superiority and supremacy. I agree with all of that. I just want to throw in something that came up last time, and it's probably going to come up every time. And that is that the source of my great hope and what puts a spring in my step, and I'm sure, Kevin, you see this every day, and we all do, and I'm sure you will all more or less agree with me, it's the next generation. I just saw an incredible article talking about millennials, and it began, of course you're annoyed with millennials. But it went on to say, do you realize that people of the millennial generation as a group challenge every major position of Donald Trump and the Republican Party? They reject them. And the widespread idea that these are people who are so glued to their cell phones and so on that they are uninformed because they don't read books. No, they may be better informed because they draw on so many different sources. This goes back to what Kevin was saying about the pivotal role of the cell phone. Yeah, it can be a mind destroyer, but it can also be a link to other people and to the real world. These people are not less connected, they're not less informed, and their values are solid. And there is I'll end by quoting somebody I quoted last time, Ron Engelhardt. Ron Engelhardt's a sociologist he has several colleagues, but a former grad student of his who's now his co-researcher, Pippa Norris. Engelhardt started doing research on the next generation in 1971 in Scandinavia. By next generation, he meant people from 18 to 35. Well, you understand he's gone through several different generations of the next generation. And his initial finding was that next generation people seem to be dramatically less materialist than the preceding generation. And so he coined the term the post-materialist. And the next was less materialist than the one before, and the next, and the next, and the next. And I just saw a statement from him. He says, if you want to define post-materialism, of course it means less concern with salary and rank, more concern with meaning and significance, but it also means post-homophobic, post-sexist, post-racist, post-ecocidal. These are people who are connecting the dots and who are in and of, by their very nature, these aren't people who have gotten over racism. They never had it. They didn't recover from sexism. They don't understand exactly what that could have been about. And they've never been ecocidal. They've always had sustainability at heart. That's cultural evolution. And that's a reason to get up in the morning.
I don't know if you remember, Jim, but this makes me think about when His Holiness the Dalai Lama was speaking off the cuff, maybe even off the record a bit, about what was going on with Chinese leadership, who have so terribly suppressed and oppressed the Tibetan culture. And at one point he just said, well, I don't know that there's anything to do but wait for the old guys to die off. Because there actually is some truth to the fact that you don't have to recover from something by which you grew up in a culture that didn't engender in you in the first place. So, gosh, we could go on and on. I want to ask Jim, Kevin, or Stephen, do you have any more to add? Stephen, did you raise your hand again?
Yes, I did. I did because I just wanted to respond a little bit to talking, again, glomming all of the next generation together, because not all millennials are in cultures where they're glued to their cell phones. There are still millennials in cultures that either because of their economic stature or just because it's not part of their culture to be glued to cell phones. There are a lot of people in Europe that are just, we might look at them and say they're hippies living on communes, but they're people who eschew cell phones and say, we don't have Facebook pages, we don't have cell phones, we read books printed on paper, we go to Waldorf schools or alternative schools. So I'm wary, at least, of overgeneralizing the millennials any more than I would be happy to have people generalize the boomers to include everybody who's between 40 and 70.
Jim?
I hope you understand that the cell phone was not the key to what I was saying about millennials. And no, you can't generalize to any generation, but is it a reasonable generalization to say, here's this group of young people who by and large do not share the values of their parents and their grandparents. Their grandparents are much likelier to be Trump supporters. Their parents are likelier to be divided, and they are, by and large, lining up on the other side. Cell phones was a throwaway. I don't want to leave the cell phone. There are people who don't have cell phones as the last nugget.
Okay, no, I get it. And Kevin, I guess I'm going to ask you if you've got some last words.
I do, and I think there is something that I want to strongly agree with you on, Jim, and that is there is this millennial generation, and the one that follows that even, is more interconnected, and so they have inherited this ability to know about each other and know about the world in a way that perhaps any other generation before us has ever known, has more access to information more instantly than any other generation has ever known. And because of that, it is unnatural for them to buy into a lot of the stereotypes and a lot of the baggage that has been handed down from generation, because they know each other in a way and can know each other more rapidly than previous generations have before. And I think that's one of the sweeping changes that's happening more and more rapidly. And it's not something that is impossible for this generation, my generation, and your generation to become a part of. We can actually get swept up and learn from them. Also, I'm happy to see that this generation, whether they be a part of Black Lives Matter, or whether they be a part of the recent children's, I don't want to call it the Children's March, but March for Our Lives, where the students took to Washington, D.C. to say that this idea of valuing guns over lives is not who we are. And I love that these voices are rising up across all sector, but many youth voices are rising up together and leading the way. And I think that shows tremendous promise as well. By the way, that generation has the capacity to infect most directly their parents and grandparents than anybody else standing in society. Do you get that, how powerful it is when your kid says, I'm not going to school and I dare you to make me? And it's one of the most disruptive tactics. It's one of the most brilliant disruptive tactics I've seen, because as a parent, I know what I would have to drop everything and really pay attention to why my child decides that he or she is not going to school and what. So I think that there's tremendous power and potential, and I believe that sweeping change is something we can all get on board with as well. I think we should get on board with as well.
Okay.
Thank you, Kevin. Yes, and Jim is saying, yeah, I get that part. Okay, well, I'm sorry we have to wrap up, but I think that it's fair to say that we've come full circle in kind of unanimous support of the thesis of cultural sea change, which is gradually over time, our shared values as a civilization are evolving toward a closer and closer fit with reality. Maybe next time we can talk about what the hell reality is. But in the meantime, I would like to thank you, all of the panelists. This was a really enjoyable discussion. The recording of it will be available tomorrow, and you'll receive a notice about where you can take that link. And in fact, you can take that link from the YouTube post and carry this discussion further if you would like to, using the video yourself. I'd like to thank our attendees and tell you that next month, New Thought on the News is May 24th. And at that time, Jim's going to be joined by the spiritual director of Centers for Spiritual Living, Dr. Ken Gordon. So thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Jim. And over and out. Bye-bye.